Today I will be updating my wildcard crafting guide. The first part of this video will be for mythic wildcards, while the second part will be for rare wildcards. I will go from set to set, starting with Ixalan. Timestamps for each set will be in the comments down below. And as always, make sure to check the date for when this video was released to make sure you are not watching the crafting guide from several months ago during another set. You can always check my channel if I have an updated more recent video. Alright, so let's go through the disclaimers first. So first off, 95% of these recommendations are based upon what is currently working in the competitive scene, focused on the SCG Open, Classic and Invitationals. The remaining 5% of the cards I will be talking about will be based upon my own opinions, in which case I will make it clear that those 5% are my own opinions. Secondly, I am aware that there are other decks and cards that can work in MTG Arena for the latter, but this video will only focus on the consistent decks and the cards that works well in a competitive SCG environment. Otherwise this video could go on for 4 hours if I had to talk about every card that might work. For example, the 1000 Year Storm deck is a decent fun combo deck, but it is not consistent and has never had a showing in the competitive environment that is the SCG. Therefore it is excluded from this list. Thirdly, I choose to exclude the cards that makes up Gruul aggro / Gruul midrange, mainly because the deck has yet to prove itself to be a proper tier 1 deck, even though it has had a few showing very close to the top 8 in the SCG. I will also exclude cards from decks that has had only a single successful showing, or cards that has been in a successful deck but only for a single event before being replaced. And as always, if you have any questions regarding the cards on this list or any other cards in the standard, feel free to ask down below. Alright, so let's begin with Mythix and let's begin with Ixalan. To be honest, there's not that much here to even talk about. The only card I can really talk about here is gonna be Raska the Relic Seeker. Some people are still playing her, but even when she was played a lot more, it was only as a one-off, so she's not really required, but you can include her in certain Dread Horde Sultai decks as a sideboard card, but it's not required. Carne's Tyrant is completely irrelevant as of this moment. And that concludes Ixalan. Yeah, all the other cards are actually quite terrible. Let's move to Rivals. So, Rivals. Here we have Rekindling Phoenix. This is a card that you should have if you are playing anything with red, really. The card is always going to be strong, and once we get the Eternal format for MTG Arena, this will be a staple until something better is printed. But even in our current standard, this guy is still seeing play, and you will need between 2 and 4 copies depending on what deck you are playing. Otherwise, there's nothing real on this page to talk about at all, and the only card to talk about on this page is going to be the Immortal Sun. This card is still seeing play. It's mainly a sideboard card and mainly used with Carne and certain toolbox decks. Overall, this card is still good, but it's not a card that you are required to own. However, having a single copy can never be a bad thing. Let's move on to Dominaria. Right, so Dominaria. History of Benali is still a great card and is still being used in mono white, and you probably want all 4 copies. Lyra Dawnbringer is mainly a sideboard card, mainly for Super Friends and other versions. Currently she's seeing between 2 and 3 copies in the sideboard. Anything more than that is overkill, and even 3 is debatable, but 2 in the sideboard is not a bad idea, especially for Super Friends. And is that everything? No. We also have Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Well, he's a staple and he's being played in Super Friends. This is a card that you certainly do need to make Super Friend work, and you need between 3 to 4 copies. 4 is actually preferred at the moment, but you can get away with 3 copies. The card is just very good until it rotates. And that, oh yeah, I did forget Carne. We also have Carne. This card is always going to be good, and it's currently seeing play as well. However, you don't need more than 2 copies in the current standard. I have 4 copies just because I like the card and I like making very weird decks that include Carne. Let's take a moment to talk about Mox Amber. It did see some play during the first few weeks of War of the Spark. However, as of late, it's kind of faded out once again, so it's another card that you're not required to own, and currently I can't even recommend it for anything really. Alright, let's move to M19, and here we have Ajani, Adversary of Tyrant. This card is really good, however, you only need him if you're gonna play tokens, and you only need a total of 2. Some people run with 3, but 2 is the more standard, and to be honest, not many people run tokens, even though the deck is still decent. Anyway, let's move on to the next card, and that's gonna be Nexus of Fate. Obviously, this card is banned in best of 1 in MTG Arena, so you are gonna have to make a best of 3 deck if you wanna play this card, and if you do want to play it, you are gonna need all 4 copies. Although Nexus of Fate is at the moment on a downward trend, it's not being played as much anymore. The deck is still functional and is still good, however there are other options, and obviously if you're playing best of 1 you can't even use it. Alright, so let's take a moment and talk about Vivian Reed. This card used to be really popular, but at the moment there is just not enough space for it. But the card is still good, and certain decks are still using it or coming back to it. But as of right now, I can't recommend that you craft it, but it is a card that you might want to own. It's very hard to judge this card at the moment, because it might come back into fashion very soon. This is one of the cards where you have to do some research and figure out if it is still worth playing, depending on what rank you're playing on and whatever you're facing. Let's move on to Crucible of Worlds. This card is starting to see a little bit of play, mostly because we have Nissas running everywhere, but the card is mainly a sideboard card, and it can also work in certain Carne deck where you use your Carne to fetch artifacts from the sideboard. Obviously you do want a Nissa on the board as well. Vivian Reed has completely fallen out of favor. The card is still good, but there are just better cards right now, so Vivian Reed is not actually seeing play anymore. Let's take a quick moment to talk about the Mutable. This card is currently not seeing play right now, mainly because control decks kinda went out of the window, but assuming that the control decks will eventually come back, and assuming it is before the rotation, the Immutable one is still a decent card to actually have for control, but most control decks could actually play without it, and those who did include him only needed a single copy. But that concludes M19. Let's move on to Guilds of Ravnica. And here we have Arc-like Phoenix. You want 4 copies if you're gonna play any kind of Phoenix decks, and that's about it. It is pretty much the only deck in Standard that is currently utilizing the Phoenix. And that kind of concludes this entire page. Ral is kinda dead as of right now because the Drake deck kinda died. The Phoenix deck still works, but the Drake deck has lost a lot of power in the current Standard. Let's move to the next page, and first we're going to talk about Raska, the Golgarian Queen. At the start of War of the Spark, she didn't see any play at all, but she's slowly coming back into fashion, and usually as a 2 to 3 copy in any kind of Sultai deck. The card will always be good until rotation, pretty much. Alright, so let's move to the token cards. So first we have the Dryad. You still need this card if you're gonna play green-white tokens, and you need at least 3 copies. 4 copies has been played, but 3 copies is more of the standard. March of the Multitude is kinda in an odd spot at the moment. Some people are using all 4 copies in the token decks, others are using 0, and some people are using 2. It's up to you which combination is working for you and whatever rank you're currently at. As we all know, certain decks and cards are more powerful depending on what rank you currently are playing at. Alright, so let's move from Guilds of Ravnica to Ravnica Allegiance. So the only card I'm gonna talk about on the first page is gonna be Spawn of Mayhem. Currently, Red Wins is the best aggro deck in Standard, and the red-black deck that did exist kinda just vanished. However, on the ladder it still works, but to be honest, Red Wins is just so cheap to make, so why would you waste your wildcards to create the black-red aggro deck? If you do want to play something different than Red Wins, then the black-red aggro deck still works, but you are gonna need the full playset of Spawn of Mayhem to make it really shine. Although at the very top end, it is not that good anymore. But that is everything on this first page. So let's move over to Hydroid Crazes. If you're playing green and blue, you want to play this guy, and you do need 4 copies. There's nothing really to say about it. It is probably the best card in Standard right now when it comes to Mythix, and it is a card that you really should own if you're playing any of those colors. Obviously, if you're playing like aggro decks or token decks, you don't need this guy, but you sure would like to have it in your deck. The card is just amazing, but unless you're playing those colors, you don't need it. However, since most people are playing Super Friends at the moment and other interesting decks, you're probably gonna want the card anyway. Obviously, you do need it for Sultai Dreadhorde. So let's finally move to War of the Spark. And to be honest, this is gonna be really short as well. On the first page, the only card I can really talk about is gonna be Liliana Dreadhorde General. This card is seeing a bit of play in certain lists when it comes to Esper Super Friends or superheroes, whatever. But mainly it is seeing play as a one-off, and it is not really required. You can debate for a very long time if this card is even worth including in superheroes, but if we're gonna have that debate, we're gonna be here for quite some time. It is up to you if you want to use her in your Esper Super Friends deck or any Super Friend deck, or I guess Sultai to a certain degree. However, the card is not required in any of the decks to make them work. Personally, I don't like her, but it's up to you. So let's take a moment and talk about Nicolas Boas. This card has not had a history of success, but it is slowly creeping up in the power ranking. But right now, it's not too commonly seen. Mainly, it has been seen in mass manipulation decks, as a few copies of. But I can't recommend that you craft it right now, but this is another one where you have to look out for because it might very soon be in fashion. Anyway, that is gonna conclude the Mythic wildcard crafting part of this video, and let's now move on to the rare cards. Alright, so welcome to the rare wildcard crafting part of this guide, and let's start with Ixalan. Alright, so first off, Legion's Landing. If you're gonna play anything that includes white and creatures, you are gonna need Legion's Landing. The card is still amazing, and you're gonna need 4 copies. Next up we have the Honor Guard. This is mainly a sideboard card against Sultai Dreadhorde, and depending on your ranking you might not need it, and obviously if you're playing best of ones, we can have a very long debate if you should include this or not. It is all up to you to decide that, mainly based upon how many Sultai Dreadhorde decks you're currently facing. Like if you're not facing any, you don't need it, but you're facing a lot of Explore package, you probably want to put this in your main board, even if you're playing best of ones. Let's move on to blue, and of course we're going to talk about Search for Azcanta. This is still being played, but it depends on deck to deck, and usually you're only seeing 1 to 2 copies, although some people still run with 4. It is up to you, but 2 copies can never be wrong. Let's move on to Entrancing Melody. This is mainly a sideboard card and mainly for mass manipulation decks. The card is obviously still good, and you do want 1 to 2 copies, but it's mainly if you're gonna play mass manipulation decks. Let's keep on going, and well, I'm gonna talk about Ruscus Contempt. Currently, it's not seeing play anymore. They're just better options, but the card is still good, so if you don't have better options and you're still owning Ruscus Contempt, you can still use the card. However, I cannot recommend that you actually craft the card anymore, at least for standard. We'll see once we get the MTG Arena Eternal format and see if Ruscus Contempt is still gonna be a good card then. Anyway, let's move on, and there's nothing else on this page. Is there anything on this page? Actually, there is not. Alright, so let's talk about the Hostage Taker for a moment. He used to see play in Sultai, but once Sultai became Sultai Dreadhorde, he's no longer seeing play, mainly because Sultai Dreadhorde is so packed with Explorer and Hydrocrisis, there's no space for this guy anymore. But if you still have him and have a few copies, he can still work, but you would be better just including Dreadhorde, to be honest. Alright, so let's talk about Spyglass for a moment. Depending on who you ask, Spyglass is either amazing or Spyglass is completely dreadful. It's up to you if you want to use it or not. It is a sideboard card, so if you're playing best of one, you don't even need it. Alright, so let's move on, and that's actually going to be everything from Ixalan. Let's move over to Rivals. So, Rivals of Ixalan. White cards. Nope. Blue cards. Let's have a look. Actually, not as well. Black cards. No. Alright, so Dire Fleet Daredevil. This is mainly a sideboard card for red deck wins, but depending on who you ask, this is either okay or it is trash. Personally, I don't like it, but some people are using it to success in the sideboard. But once again, if you're playing best of ones, you don't need this guy at all. Alright, so let's move on to Jadelight Ranger. Obviously, if you're playing Sultai Dreadhorde or anything that is using the Explore package, you are gonna need 4 copies of Jadelight Ranger, you can't get around it. The card is just too amazing and I can't wait for the rotation to remove it from the standard. Alright, so I think that was everything from Rivals. I guess I can take a moment and talk about the Arc. The Arc is still very good, however, because the mana bases are so sketchy right now, and with so many tap land and 3-color decks, you really can't fit this into any deck that could actually use it. But the card is not bad, and if you actually have it, you can still use it, but if you do have all the other lands, you're probably gonna end up dumping this card, or you're just gonna get completely mana screwed in a lot of games, or just getting the wrong colors. Anyway, let's move on to Dominaria. Alright, so let's talk about the Marshal. If you're playing tokens, or if you're playing white creatures, or white blue, or white green that's also creature based, you are probably gonna need a full playset of 4 Marshals. The card is just that good. But if you're playing things like Super Friends and Superheroes, you don't need this card at all. Right, so let's talk about the Djinn. Currently, Mono Blue is not being played at all in the pro scene. It's kinda weird, the deck is still really good and can still function, but it's just not seeing play. Obviously, on the ladder, Mono Blue is still a good deck to use, and you can certainly go very far with the deck, and it is really cheap, so if you want to play Mono Blue, I can still recommend that you actually craft this deck, but if you're only looking at the pro scene, then I can't recommend the card, which is kind of a weird thing to say for once. Usually what works on the ladder and what works in the pro scene tends to be very similar. Anyway, let's move on, and we're gonna move on to the Chain Dweller. Obviously, if you're playing mono red or red deck wins, you are gonna need Goblin Chain Dweller, and you're gonna need 4 copies. There's no way to get around it, the card is just too good, and it's another one of those cards that I can't wait for to rotate out of standard. Anyway, let's move on, and we're gonna talk about Helm of the Host. This card is seeing play in certain Carne decks, mainly Carne with the toolbox. You're basically using the new Carne together with like 13 artifacts in the sideboard that you can fetch in, and obviously you can fetch in Helm of the Host and stick it onto something interesting. The card is very good, but it's a very specific card, and honestly Carne Toolbox is not seeing too much of a success, but it is a deck that is being played, and it is quite fun, so I thought I would actually mention it. But outside of Carne Toolbox, this card has no room in any deck. Alright, so let's move on to M19, and this one is gonna be really fast. White cards, no. Blue cards, no. Black cards, no. Red cards. Banefire. You need at least one Banefire for sideboard. Sometimes you want 2 in the sideboard, but pretty much never more than 2. There were a couple of weeks where people took out Banefire from red deck wins in the sideboard. It was very bizarre, but it is back now, and overall the card is just good, and anyone who runs red should probably have Banefire in the sideboard. It is just that good. I do believe that you get one Banefire from one of the starter decks somewhere, but I could be wrong. In any case, that is the only red card that I can actually recommend, and that is actually being played in the pro scene. How about green cards? Well, we do have Torn Lieutenant. This card is still really good and is mainly a sideboard card in certain deck. We have seen it in Sultai, we have seen it in tokens. Obviously the card is really hard to deal with just because it makes tokens. But apart from that, if you're not playing best of 3, you don't really need this card unless you're facing tons of opponents that are doing single target spell removals, in which case Torn Lieutenant might be a good choice to include in the main board. Otherwise, there is nothing else that is green. Right, so Detection Tower. Well, Carnage Tyrant kinda went back to his place and is no longer seeing play, so you don't really need Detection Tower anymore, and most decks can't really justify including the card because your mana base is already really sketchy, and if you start including cards like Detection Tower, you will have games where you just sit there and like go, well, land, wrong land, maybe right land, oh it's tapped, oh I'm at 2 HP and I died. You just can't include this without really suffering if you're playing multicolor decks. And obviously if you're playing red deck wins, you are not going to care about hexproof, you're just going to try to aggro them out and kill them in some experimental frenzy fashion. That was a really weird sentence. Anyway, that is going to conclude M19. Let's move on to Guilds of Ravnica. So, white cards. We have the Loxodon. You need this card if you play tokens, and if you play any kind of white creature strategy. The card is just too good. But it's not broken such as Jadelight Ranger. This is a really good card though. Right, so let's move on. Blue cards, we gonna say no. Black cards. Midnight Reaper did see a lot of play in Sultai. However, Sultai Dreadhorde just don't have the space for him, so I can no longer recommend this card. Let's move on to red, and here we actually have a few good cards. First off, we have the Steenkin. You do need this in red deck wins pretty much, and you need 4 copies. Next up, we have the Legion Warboss. This is a great sideboard card for anyone who can run red, just because it's very hard to deal with the stream of tokens, and if you don't deal with them early enough, they can pretty much win the game even if you have an Explore package, because you can probably aggro down a Sultai Dreadhorde deck to such a low health that the Dreadhorde will be completely useless, or they might bring back 1 creature then die. Let's move on to risk factor. Depending on who you ask, this is either still good or it is terrible. Personally, I'm 50-50. You don't really need a card anymore, but you can still use it in certain red deck wins. It's up to you. This is one of those that could be good or could be bad. It all depending on what your current rank is and what you're facing the most. Next up we have Experimental Frenzy. You want all 4 copies and you want it for red deck wins and for certain other interesting deck as well. The card is just, well, the card should never have been printed. It's just so disgusting to actually see it actually being played. Now, depending on who you ask, you're either going to see 4 in the main board or a split between Experimental Frenzy and Chandra. We're going to get to Chandra a bit later, but personally, I'm in the camp that Chandra is completely dreadful for red deck wins, but some people are still using her. Anyway, let's move on to green creatures, and here we have nothing. Multicolor creatures, well, Thief of Sanity is still a good card, but mainly a sideboard card, and not all decks actually run him anymore. but this is a card I can recommend that you still use. But if you're strictly following what is being played in the pro scene, this is a card that you can actually skip now. Let's keep on going, and I'm gonna stop at Assassin's Trophy. This card is now seeing mainboard play in Sultai Dreadhorde, mainly because we have so many planeswalkers that actually has to be dealt with. The card is obviously very good, and most of you who has played for a longer time probably already have the required 2 copies. If you don't feel like crafting the card, you can get around not using it, but the card is just really good at the moment, and it's probably always going to be a really good card, especially once we move into Eternal formats in MTG Arena. This card is just too good to not have. Right, so Find Finality. Because we have so many new planeswalkers that pretty much do things better than these cards, Find Finality is no longer being played, but if you still own the cards and you don't own all the new cards, this is a card you can use as a replacement, but you want eventually to get the Nissa, get the Tamio, etc. So I would not recommend that you craft this card, but if you still have it and don't have all the new cards yet, this is a card you can still use. Deafening Clarion is seeing a tiny bit of play if you're playing certain Super Friend decks that are obviously including those colors. Anyway, that's gonna leave us with the Accord. This is another one of those cards that some people are using to success, other people are foregoing. It's up to you. Usually you see between 2 to 3 copies when it is being played, but it is one of those cards that you can replace and live without. Of course, it is played mainly in tokens. And finally we have Night of Autumn. Obviously this is mainly a sideboard card and mainly for tokens or anyone who can use it, mostly because it can destroy enchantments, and it is a quite amazing card as well. Obviously if you're playing best of 3s and facing mono red or red deck wins, well, same thing, this is a card you really want. But outside of that, you don't actually need a card. Alright, so Ravnica Allegiance. Hero of Precinct 1. You need 4 copies if you're playing Esper Super Friends or Superheroes, and that's about it. Tither Taker is no longer being played, but you can still make him work in certain white creature decks, but you don't need to craft him anymore. Unbreakable Formation. You probably want a single copy of this for most white creature decks and most token decks. Blue cards. Mass Manipulation. There's currently a deck that is called Mass Manipulation that is using Mass Manipulation, obviously, together with a lot of ramp in order to win games. If you're gonna play the Mass Manipulation deck, you are gonna need a full playset of 4. Sure, you can get around only using 3, but 4 is recommended if you want to be really competitive. None of the black cards are any good, and none of the red cards are played anymore. Obviously, if you're still playing the black-red aggro deck, you are gonna want to have Rix, but if you don't want to play that deck or don't have that deck, you don't need to actually craft her anymore. Is it a her or him? I'm actually not sure. Let's move on to the Incubation Druid, and this card is actually seeing a bit of play. If you're gonna use it, you do want probably at very least 3 copies. 4 copies can work as well, but 3 copies is more of a standard. Although 4 copies is not a bad choice either. Anyway, let's move on to DOD, mainly because my throat is going really raw and I can't actually pronounce its proper name. This card is still seeing play on the ladder, mainly in best of 3s and mainly if you're playing the Azorius creature aggro deck. But the deck is not that good anymore, so you don't really need to craft it. But if you're still owning a few copies, you can still use it of course, but it's no longer a super competitive deck. Alright, so let's move on to Kaya's Wrath. This is mainly a sideboard card and is used in pretty much anyone who can use it. You need between 3 to 4 copies. Anything less than 3 is probably a mistake, and well, 3 is a good number to actually own. You can go for the full 4, but it is overkill. However, once Control Decks comes back, you probably are gonna want 4 copies once more. Right, let's move on to Judith. If you are still playing the black-red aggro deck, you are gonna need 4 copies of Judith. However, the deck is no longer as relevant, so if you don't have like 3 copies already, I can't recommend that you go and craft the deck. Just as with Medieval, Cinder Wines is a really good card, but because control decks kind of vanished, you no longer need a card. But it is a card that you are gonna want once control decks comes back eventually. The same thing can be said about Gruul Spellbreaker. And I think that is gonna conclude... Yes, that is gonna conclude Ravnica Allegiance. So let's move to War of the Spark. And this one is gonna be quite short actually. White cards are all gonna be nope. Blue cards are all gonna be nope. So let's talk about the black cards. We have the Elder Spell. You pretty much want 2 copies for sideboard at the very least, and sometimes you even want it in the main board. My personal opinion, there should be more Elder Spells in all decks currently being played in the pro scene. For some reason, people are going very low with the amount of Elder Spells they are including in the sideboard, even though there are so many Planeswalkers. Anyway, you do want at least 2 copies. So command the Dread Horde. Obviously, in Sultai Dread Horde, you need this card, and pretty much anyone else who actually plays black and plays a lot of creatures and Planeswalkers is gonna want a few copies of this. But you don't need 4 copies. Most decks will be happy with 2 to 3. In the beginning of War of the Spark, we did see Commander Dread Horde as its own deck, but that quickly faded away. It just is too unreliable. There's too many things that can go wrong, and if you're facing a lot of aggro decks and your only plan is Commander Dread Horde, you're gonna lose. And if you're gonna rely on simply Explore package to carry you, just play Sultai Dread Horde or Sultai. Anyway, let's move on to one of my most hated card that is currently actually being played in the pro scene, and that is Chandra. I'm in the camp that Chandra is terrible and she's too slow for what you want in red deck wins currently. Some people disagree and they think she's okay. It is up to you if you want to use her or not, and if you can find success. Personally, I'm gonna say don't waste your time with her, just go with 4 Experimental Frenzy. Other people are gonna say include 2 copies or include 2 copies in the sideboard. I will leave this one up to you. Let's move on to Sarkhan the Masterless. In the beginning of War of the Spark, we saw a few Super Friend decks that relied on Sarkhan the Masterless to be the win con by attacking with the Planeswalkers due to his first ability. As it stands right now, that deck is no longer really being played, so there's no reason for you to actually own Sarkhan, but the deck still functions, they're just better deck. So once again, if you want to use it for a red version of Super Friends, go ahead, but for anything else the card is dreadful. Anyway, let's move on to Nissa. Now this card is being played in Sultai, in Super Friends, in Superheroes, blah 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 blah, mass manipulations, etc. The card is really good. It does have a few weaknesses, and sometimes the card will end up costing you the game because you don't draw enough lands, or you made the wrong land into a creature that then died, and then you locked yourself out of the game. But the card is actually a lot better than I first anticipated. Anyway, let's move on to a card that I did praise quite a lot, and that is Teferi, the Time Reveler. Yeah, I know, Wizards, you don't care for Legacy at all, so you made this card. You probably want 3 to 4 copies. The card is amazing. The card should never have been printed, but the card is amazing, and that's all I'm gonna say about it. It is just disgusting, but it is a good card. Next up we have Oath of Kaya. Now personally, I'm not a big fan of this card. I feel it's just too slow, but we are currently playing so many late game scenarios that the card is actually functional. But once we get more control, more aggro, this is one of those cards that you're probably gonna see actually vanishing. The card is good, don't get me wrong, and it is being used in superheroes, etc. but it has a lot of weaknesses, and sometimes you end up just not doing anything because half your hand was Oath of Kaya. But I will still recommend that you do craft between 2 and 3 copies, depending on what deck you're playing and how many you feel like you are currently in need of. Next up, we're gonna talk about Sauron. He saw a little bit of play in the beginning, but currently Sauron is kinda gone. But this is once again one of those cards that will eventually be good once he gets the proper deck to support him / support. But you don't need to craft him right now. Another card that I want to talk about is going to be Enter the God Eternals. This saw a tiny bit of play in a top 8. The card is not terrible, but it is a bit slow and there are better options. But because it was actually successful in a top 8, I feel like I have to kind of mention it, even though it might be one of those Jake's situations where the card is irrelevant, but because it is being played in a pro scene, I actually have to mention it. Let's move on to the next page. I'm gonna talk about Dominar. This card is really good, but currently Super Friends is just too oppressive and too dominant in the format for Dominar to be a proper threat. But eventually, once again, this is one of those that can become a really good card. Obviously, once we get more control decks back and we get some nice creature decks, Dominar is going to be a really good card. The same can be said for Ajani the Great-Hearted. This card is good, just not as good as Ajani Adversary of Tyrants. But once Tyrants rotates out of standard, this is a decent replacement if we still have token decks then. Let's take a moment and talk about Friend to Wolves. Personally, I don't like this card, but it has seen some successful play. But once again, this is a card that you're gonna ask 10 people and half are gonna like it and half are gonna ignore it. It's up to you if you want to craft this or not, but it is not required. Obviously, this is mainly seen play in token decks. Right, so we have Tamio, Collector of Tales. This is a card that I did say was quite good in my first review of the new Planeswalkers, but it turns out to be quite a lot better than I even anticipated. You probably want the full playset of Tamios, it is just that good. If there's one thing I really despise about this card is the fact that it has that random factor with a +1. You have to name a card and if you flip that card over, you get it, otherwise into the graveyard. I just don't like having that kind of RNG and MTG, but since this is like the only really super RNG card we have that is competitive, I'm gonna let it slide. Next up we have Blast Zone. This card kinda ruined Mono Blue, but Mono Blue kinda vanished on its own. This card hard counters Mono Blue, but most 3-color decks in Standard can't afford to include it, but its presence alone makes Mono Blue not a super attractive choice when it comes to competitive play. But its very existence is keeping Mono Blue out from the very top of the competitive scene, which, I don't know, what do I dislike watching more, Mono Blue or Super Friends? It's a hard choice. Anyway, you don't need to craft the card right now, but eventually it might become a really good card in Standard. Obviously, in Eternal formats, once we get it into Standard, this will be amazing, and in that case you're gonna want at least 2 to 3. Alright, so let's take a moment and talk about Khan's Bastion. This card is actually quite decent. It has seen some play in decks that has been successful, but using the card is very scary in triple color decks because it's so easy to lock yourself out of the right colors and actually lose just because of your lands. So I can't recommend that you actually craft this because it is so hard to make it work in Super Friends or anyone who can actually use it. And more than often the card is quite dead, but it is a card that has seen a certain degree of play. Anyway, let's move on to Carne. This card is mainly seeing play in Carne toolbox decks. Basically, what it allows you to do is use your sideboard as your +1. So you get to pick something in your sideboard and bring it into your hand. you mainly want to bring in things like Helm of the Host and Golems. Outside of that though, there's no really place for this guy, but if you want to play the Carne toolbox deck, you do probably want between 2 and 3 copies of this version. And finally we have Ugin. This card is on and off. Some decks are using it, but mainly as a one-off. It's not terrible, but there are better options, and once again, you don't really need it. But if you do open one, you can go ahead and use it. However, you don't need to go out of your way to actually craft the card. It is not that good. And finally, we do have all the rare lands, although this part is really simple. You want 4 copies of all the dual color lands. There's no way around it. If you want to be the most competitive player in the game, you do need 4 copies of all the lands that you are using. Of course, if you only play mono red and mono blue, you actually can get away without owning any of the dual color lands. But otherwise, you need as many copies as you can afford. As you can see, I have 3 copies of most of the dual lands, and then I have 4 copies in a couple of cases, such as Sulphur's Fall, and I think I have 4 breeding pools as well. And on a final note, they tend to reprint the friendly dual color lands. I think we have like 7 different Glacial Fortress now, and of course if you own one, it is legal in all formats and it's legal in standard if they reprint it. So that shouldn't be an issue in case you are worried about wasting wildcards on lands that will soon rotate out of standard. The same can be said for the enemy dual color lands, however, they tend to not be reprinted as much as the friendly ones. Keep in mind this only applies to lands that enters the field untapped if you're already controlling a basic land. Lands such as Stomping Ground, Breeding Pool, or other lands that you can pay life to have entered untapped are more than likely not being reprinted anytime soon. And that will conclude this video. I will have to make another update very soon because we are already almost at the launch of M20, so there will be quite a few sets to go through. Anyway, don't forget to sub and click on bells and stuff like that. I will see you next time. This is Project signing out.